Okay, welcome back. And thanks for coming back. Beautiful sunny day in Oxford. We love working with diehards. So we're very fortunate to have Mark Spelman here. Mark is responsible for global thought leadership at Accenture. And that sounds like such a fun job. Apparently they actually pay him to do this as well. And Mark has been a great partner and collaborator with us over the years. And we want to explore this idea about the corporation and its relationship to the rest of the world and also sort of to GSNs in particular. So if we flash back a few decades, Milton Friedman, the purpose of a corporation is to make money for its shareholders, full stop. And the very clear conclusion that he drew from that was that as long as a company is behaving within the law of whatever society it was, that is completely acceptable behavior. So if you exist within a society that has laws that permit slavery, then it's quite or if bribery is the way that things function in your country, then corporations are not only it's not only appropriate for them to behave that way, that's a necessary way of behaving. In any other way undermines the purpose of the corporation, which is to create value for its shareholders. Then we had this whole sort of period of corporate social responsibility, where many well-meaning CSR people said, no, you do well by doing good in society. And I mean, my view was that wasn't true. Lots of companies did well by being really bad, by externalizing their costs onto society, by having terrible labor practices, by, polluting the environment and so on. But there's something big that's happening right now in terms of many leading companies and how they see themselves and their role in society in general and also in these new networks. So Mark, let me start off just sort of with a simple question. What would you think is the role of the corporation in society? And is it changing?
And is it changing? So let me start two ways. I think I like to think about what is a good business and the characteristics of a good business as opposed to what does it mean for business to do good. And I think that's quite interesting. So what does a good business actually look like? And I think one of the reasons why the Milton Friedman quote doesn't work anymore is because I think it's around license to operate. And if you look at businesses licensed to operate, actually what you're seeing, particularly for multinational companies, is the need to not only understand, if you like, how you deliver scale, and I think that's very often linked into sort of what you're doing on a global basis, but it's also critically what you need to be doing at a local basis. And a good example of this is around branding. So a lot of people think about branding in terms of what's your market brand. Actually, when you go to many countries, what people are really interested in is what's your employee brand. Because people become interested in where the members of their family are actually sort of working. And so if you're not thinking very carefully about what your employee brand is, then you're going to be missing a sort of big trick. So as I begin to sort of unpack this thing about what does it mean to be a good business, sure, there are financial objectives, but I think increasingly you're also beginning to think about... Oh, okay. That's all right. Okay, all right. So as you begin to think about what it means to be a good business, then yes, there's some financial objectives. There are clearly sorts of market objectives in terms of what you are trying to achieve. I think very clearly there are some employee objectives because there's a very interesting, I think, discussion about where does the true basis of differentiation come from in your corporation. And I think a lot of the evidence is that true differentiation actually comes through the quality of the human capital that you've got, i.e. the skills of the people that you're able to develop within the business and retain over time. And that, I think, gets you into one sort of series of questions before you get into, I think, some of the critical issues about sort of inputs and outputs. And this was getting a little bit into where I think you finished the last session, Don, which was around I think increasingly companies are beginning to realize that you have to steward resources in its broadest sense. And that means not just how do you consume resources as part of your production process, but it is moving, I think, increasingly towards more of a sort of circular economy. And that also places responsibilities on businesses to actually look at how does it extend the life cycle of products and services. So I think, yes, we are seeing a change. I think inevitably, the really interesting question is, are we changing fast enough? And I think that one can point to some clear leaders, but I also think there are quite a lot of laggards as well.
Okay, well, before we go there, and we must, so license to operate, branding, market and employee, stewarding resources. You all know the license to operate, right? Societies give a corporation a license to operate, and we give them limited liabilities for shareholders, and societies can revoke that license if we decide that, say, Wall Street is in danger of bringing down the global economic system again. And that's why all this regulation is now starting to happen around Wall Street. Why do you think this is changing, Mark? I mean, what are the forces that are causing some business leaders to sort of step up and change their approach?
I'd like to go back to your sort of where you started this with problems. And I think what's very interesting at the moment is that one of the responsibilities of leaders is to be able to explain context. And if you look at what's going on in the world today, I think there is an economic debate. A lot of that goes around sort of growth and jobs. You have a political debate. A lot of that goes around some of the sort of the governance issues. And you have a business sort of debate. And that's a lot of that is around sort of growth and efficiency. The question is, how do you bring those together? And I think you see some leaders who are able to, if you like, interpret what's going on in the global landscape and say, what does that really mean in terms of my business strategy and how do I lead my sort of organization? But a lot of people really struggle with it. And here's a clue. Watch the people who use the word uncertainty. I would argue uncertainty is a very lazy word. Because actually what it's basically saying is, well, we're not really quite sure what's going on, but it seems to be rather messy, and therefore we will work with it. And actually I think there's a lot of things which are not uncertain at all. I think they're very predictable, demographics being one of them. And I think why it's such an interesting sort of melting pot at the moment is because you've got the economics, the politics, and the business. You've got a real language problem, which is that what you actually see is that sort of business people talk in one way, politicians talk in another. Yeah. Immigration is a classic example of that, because business people can't understand why you can't have more immigration in certain places. Politicians will basically say we can't do it because of the political sort of constraints it's under. So the conversations go like that. And then on top of that, you've got basically what I would argue is political poles clearly shifting and moving. A lot of it driven by sort of demographics. And that is challenging a lot of the underlying assumptions. And so one of the reasons why I think it's an extremely interesting time at the moment is that, and when I walk into a boardroom, you look around, and what I do is you do the eyeball test. And you just look around the room, and you look into people's eyes, and you basically say, and I sort of say, now, are you a guy who's been sort of, you got here, yeah, your assumptions are based on what it's taken you to be successful over the last 25 years. So you're a guy from the past struggling with the future. Or are you someone who really gets it in terms of understanding where things are going to go? And you can go around the boardroom, and any time you just eyeball people, just look at them, and it's so easy to tell. And that then tells you something about the nature of the challenge, yeah, of what it's going to take to move the organization forward.
What are the characteristics that you're looking for in eyeballs? I'm sure curiosity is one.
Yeah, I think, well, I suppose I'm fortunate enough that I've got my three children are 23, 21 and 19. So if you really want to understand lead indicators of where consumers are going, look at what your 23, 21 and 19-year-old do. And you look at most people in boardrooms who are 50 and 60-year-olds, and basically they're not connected. And you know this well, Don, because of all the stuff that you've sort of been doing. But I think that if you really want to sort of understand where things are sort of going to go, you've got to have some indication, you've got to have some understanding of lead indicators. And it's very interesting at the moment that if you talk about the digital debate, so digital debate, if I go into a boardroom, it probably goes, you can have privacy, you can have transparency, you can have cyber security, you can have cyber crime. It's all over the shop at the moment in terms of where the debate truly is in a sort of boardroom. And so I guess what I would say, if I'm really sort of looking into people's eyeballs and sort of just sort of trying to test them, I'm really trying to sort of say, do you really understand what some of those lead indicators are? If you get into the sort of speed and pace and scale at which things like digital are transforming, do you really sort of get that? And what are you using to sort of get it? And I think that to me sort of begins to sort of tell, as I say, where organizations are at and whether the boardroom's truly got it.
Now, Roger Martin, who was the dean of the business school at the University of Toronto, wrote a book called The Responsibility Virus. And he said that corporations are starting to change because more and more CEOs and senior executives are waking up to the fact that you just need to be a good person. And that it's a deep sense of social, that these are people who have a strong personal value system and ethics, and that the corporations that are really changing are those people. There's an alternative or opposite point of view, is that transparency is causing corporations and corporate leaders to get naked. And if you're going to get naked, you got to get buff. Basically, fitness is no longer optional. So companies, for more reasons having to do with the fact that everything they're doing is being disclosed. They can't build a good employee brand and so on, or customer brand. They're changing their behavior. Would you agree with one or some combination of that point of view, or do you have another one? Why are they changing?
Well, I would definitely say both are important.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt about it. I think people are much more conscious of the transparency issue. You can't hide things under the table. Things are going to find their way out. Mm-hmm. So, for example, our organisation employs 290,000 people, and if you try and sort of shovel something under the carpet somewhere, it's going to come out because someone's going to tweet something, going to say something.
Yeah.
If you have a bad experience in the marketplace, someone's going to sort of tweet it or put it out there. So, I think yes, it is sort of. I think we do live in a world which is becoming more transparent. I think what that drives you to is the importance of principles, because one of the things I've always sort of done is that if I have 17 people who work for me around the world, I don't know what the guy in Singapore is doing day by day. I can't possibly be managing that. So what that means is, from a principle point of view, is you have to set some parameters up for that person. And then there's a very interesting discussion about failure. Because inevitably what will happen at some point is that the guy in Singapore will do something which is different from the way that I would sort of do it. And the question then is, how do you handle that? And if basically failure is unacceptable, which means you put your head above the parapets and you get shot, then you've got to drive yourself into bureaucracy and into a sort of basically sort of justification for any action you're going to take. So I think that transparency is a good thing, and I think we're seeing more of that. However, I would really like to argue that I think the whole question, it's not just about values, which I do think values are critically important. But I think increasingly, as you look at what's happening in Africa, as you look at what's happening in various parts of Asia, it's all about, I think, emotional intelligence skills that you want in your leaders. It's the ability to understand cross-culture. It's the ability to collaborate. And that becomes very important in a multi-stakeholder environment. And I think that one of the critical things is we haven't got enough leaders at the moment who really, I think, understand some of the issues around multi-stakeholder, cross-cultural types of issues. And I think particularly in international organizations, that's going to be very important. The other thing that we're seeing is increasingly, I think we're seeing big companies working with small companies. And so as we're sort of seeing more younger people trying to get out of the unemployment trap by setting up and running their own businesses, then the question is, how does that network work into big companies? And big companies are not very well tuned up to actually sort of working with particularly smaller organizations. That is another dimension to cross-culture, which I think is going to be hugely important sort of going forward. And actually, I'll say this very much from a sort of an Accenture Anderson Consulting. I do believe that one of the critical values in leadership is humility. And if you ever want a really good example of why you need to be humble, it was Arthur Anderson and Anderson Consulting. Because I could very easily have been on the Arthur Anderson side. And basically, sort of, when it went bust in 2001, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people ended up in the other three big accounting firms. I was fortunate enough in Anderson Consulting. We basically went through arbitration. We had to give up the Anderson name. We became Accenture, and the corporations continued to grow. But that's a lesson in humility, because you could have easily been on the other side of the fence. And I think in this more complex world, you need leaders who are also humble. Okay,
but what about the quarterly report? I mean, we have this tyranny that sort of locks leaders into short-termism. I mean, how do we overcome this problem? How do you think long-term and think about doing the right thing when your shareholders are going to be all over you if you don't have good quarterly numbers?
Well, I think the answer to that is it's an and world. I think however much people like to rail about the sort of the tyranny of the quarterly results, the answer is it's not going to go away quickly unless you've got the guts of someone like a Paul Polman who's basically going to say we're not going to play like that. But there aren't that number of chief execs who are going to do that, partly because the life expectancy of chief execs, frankly, is 3 to 4 years, and so you've got to decide where you want to play. But I do think the real trick is actually being able to balance short-term and long-term. And I think the really interesting question, which nobody really picks up enough, is the real trick of leadership is not short-term, long-term, it's medium-term. Actually, it's horizon 2. And I think that's very interesting when you sort of get into some of the issues that we're sort of talking about here, is that the really good leaders are the ones, I think, who can provide. It's about navigation, it's about journey, it's about the critical milestones, but it's also about giving people sort of what I call the horizon 2 goals, so that you can look beyond just the immediacy. And obviously, when you're running a corporation which is going by quarterly goals, you also have to recognize how much headroom you've got. Because I think you, to a certain extent, basically the quarterly results, you set the expectations. Mm-hmm. You set the expectations when you put out your forward guidance there, all right? And then you're on the treadmill. But you've also got some aspect of how much flex do you put into that. And I think if you can create some headroom and you can manage to horizon 2 and you've got some sense of horizon 3, that to me is what sort of leaders need to do. So for me, again, a good acid test of good leadership is about being able to manage the multiple time frames. And a really good example when we talk about cities tomorrow, and particularly when I look at it in the context of energy. Energy is a very good example of a topic where there is very poor understanding of time frame. So everything gets mucked up in an energy discussion. You get people talking about nuclear plants, people talking about renewables, people talking about sort of gas. The answer is
solar roads.
And it's because there's no consistency in terms of the time frame, and it's all over the shop. And so what you need is much more, I think, sort of clarity around where do you make an impact short term, where can you make an impact medium term, and what are the longer term trends you're trying to navigate to. And I think that is part of what I would describe as responsible leadership going forward.
Now, why do we have so few of these leaders as CEOs? I mean, where do these people come from? And what's the system that creates people that don't think like this?
Well, I don't get many sort of plaudits when I sort of say this to some sort of audiences. But at the moment, we've got a load of CEOs out there who act like COOs. So chief execs acting like chief operating officers. And why is that happening? Well, it's not surprising at one level, because the last 5 years, there's been a premium on keep your heads down and generate the cash out. So what has actually happened, I think, is that we have overemphasized the operating gene to the detriment of some of the other critical genes. And so the danger is that although that's, I think, necessary, it's not sufficient. And if you end up putting too many operators into your business, then I think you lack some of the sort of the creative side. And I think it's very interesting that if you look at whatever organization you represent at the moment, just look at how many of the sort of top team are basically highly analytically driven. versus the creative and innovation side of the equation. And I think actually what you're looking for in your top team is a much better balance between sort of the analytics side and the creative and innovative side. And I think that also plays that diversity thing. I'd like to just put one other sort of dimension in there, is that I do think that we're going to, over time, have to get smarter about sort of, it's not just the 50 and 60-year-old guys that you want in the top team. And if you look at too many boards of too many corporates today, they're all the old guard. And I think that's part of, we're going to have to change that.
They're all operations people too.
There's a lot of operations guy in the management teams, and there's a lot of older guys in the executive boards.
And they are guys.
And they are guys. And I think we need to. I think we're going to have to change that dynamic going forward. And again, I don't think it's necessarily going to change fast, but I think we all have positions of responsibility, and I think that's one of the trends that I would look for. I think, sorry, Don, one other thing I'll just say. There's a very interesting dynamic, I think, about management versus ownership. And one of the things, particularly those of us who live in sort of Western Europe and North America, I don't think have fully understood, is that as sovereign wealth funds grow, what is going to happen is the ownership structures of lots of multinationals are going to change. And so if you go around in the UK and you say, okay, well, Barclays, Sainsbury's, BP have all got sovereign wealth funds with basically owning sort of structures at the moment, that is only going to go one way. You look at sort of Dubai ports are now building the big container port on the east dock of London. That China is going to be building nuclear power stations in the UK. That is part of the sort of the fundamental change of what's going to happen. So you've got an ownership issue, you've got a management issue, and actually I think those two dynamics are going to change and going to be very interesting going forward.
Is that a good thing though, to have these sovereign funds, some of them coming from pretty repressive governments?
Well, I think this is part of how sort of, if you like, capital is going to get recycled around the globe. And as capital is getting accumulated, particularly in Asia, that's going to recycle. Now, you've got some good ones, Norway, Singapore. You've got some slightly more marginal ones, Qatar put up there and sort of say, and I think the straight answer is, but that's part of the fact that not everybody's going to play by the same rules. And we've seen that with Russia and China recently. And so, you see, I think sort of just setting out there and saying the norms are going to be set by the US and Europe, I think that's not the world that we're actually going to live in. And we've already seen that, which is, if you like, what I would say is that we've had globalization with big E and small p. And by that, I mean we've had globalization with big economics and small politics. And the politics we've been able to subsume relative to the economics. What we're just about to see is that globalization is going to move into a different phase where politics is going to be much more equally balanced with economics. And as it becomes more equally balanced, you're going to see different rules of the game. And China and Russia in particular are not going to play by the same rules as people in the US and Western Europe want them to play by. And we're going to have to recognize that and live with that.
I'd like to throw it out to the audience. Just before I do that, I want to just make a point about this issue of interdependence, really, which is what you're talking about, these different parts of society having to work together in business, understanding more that they can't succeed in a world that's failing. So after the subprime crash, the Canadian banks did really, really well. And I was talking to a friend of mine named Gordon Nixon, who's the CEO of RBC, the biggest bank in Canada. And they went from number 22 to number 5. And I was having a beer with him, and I said, you must be pretty proud of yourself for pulling that off. He says, not really. We didn't really do anything. I mean, it's things we didn't do. He says the structure of the mortgage market is different in Canada. You know, you can't write off a loan. You're on the hook for a mortgage. You can't walk away from it. There's all kinds of regulation about creating these complex derivatives, and there's transparency around that. And if you look at the list of the top 50 safest banks in North America today, the top 6 are the 6 Canadian banks. No. So, government's evil, regulation's terrible, it prevents us. Regulation enabled the RBC to go from number 22 to compete with Bank of America in terms of assets value and also in terms of market cap. So I think that we're going to have to start to, in this super complex, interdependent world, we're going to need to stand back a bit and think more about how we all work together in ways that are in our common self-interest.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And again, just one quick observation on that, and then come back on some of the comments. But I think what you're seeing in banks, for example, is the regulation in the US is different from the regulation changes that are going on in Europe. And so what you're actually going to see, I think, is not necessarily total harmonious sort of regulation. And so what I think is really important for people like in this room is actually what we really need to be arguing for, I think, is smart regulation. And what we're in danger, I think, of getting is a bit of a ping pong. It's clear that the banking sector is, I think, going to get over-regulated. A lot of it, in my personal view, is their own fault. But actually, it's also not going to be in global interest if we end up in a situation where US and European regulation is, particularly in the financial sector, is out of step, and also if we do over-regulate. But I do think that we have got still some fundamental issues and challenges, particularly in Europe, around debt.
A minor topic. Okay, let's go, Natal, and then.
Thank you. That was great. So I would like to throw authenticity onto the list, in addition to sort of getting it and value and transparency. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah. So I'm Nikhil Desai with the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, and so authenticity is something that we think about a lot, right? We are a wholly owned subsidiary of Mastercard, and we're open about that, but we want to sort of be deliberate and serious about how we promote financial inclusion for the benefit of all, in a very sort of open source network way. So communicating that authenticity is something that we think about a lot, and not just communicating and signaling it, but actually doing it, right? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, let me give you two sort of dimensions there. The big problem with authenticity is 3 levels below the chief exec. Because what you're seeing in many, particularly financial institutions, is the top guy says all the right things. The real problem is the guys are caught on actually delivering it 3 levels down. And getting them to change, getting the motivations, the signals right, to be truly authentic at that level is really the sort of the acid test. And that to me is a hugely important issue around how do you drive change and the sort of the sentiments that are being expressed at the top, really through the organisation, particularly down to the front line. I think the second dimension to this is, what does authenticity mean in terms of your own personal leadership style? And I think everybody should seek to work out, if you like, what their sort of strengths and weaknesses are as a leader. I think one of the real problems with very left-brained people in leadership positions is they're not very self-aware. And that is a problem when it comes to particularly, I think, sort of multi-dimensional leadership. And basically, if you think about what Don is really talking about here in terms of multi-state, we're actually asking leaders to essentially operate in a more complex environment. Because not only have you got to worry about what your guys 3 levels below you are doing, you've actually also got to worry about that, which is all my sort of stakeholders that I need to be influencing. I've got to work with the government more, I've got to work with the civil societies more, I've got to work with my big companies and small companies in my supply. I've got to be able to, I've got much more dimensional, and by the way, my business model is probably going to be different in different parts of the world. Now, if you've not got the emotional intelligence skills and self-awareness skills, it doesn't matter how authentic you are, you're going to struggle. And I think authenticity, I really like that, but I think you have to put that into those 2 dimensions.
Is this?
How would you defend authenticity?
So I think, so we're essentially a global sort of thought leadership institute in the context of a global multi-billion-dollar corporation, right? And so those thought leadership institutes, Mark can talk about this as well, sometimes are just PR exercises. And the
optics, I believe they're called.
Yeah, and the public recognizes that, right? So, but if you're trying to do it in a different way, you're trying to do authentic. Right? You're actually trying to seriously advance the conversation for us as financial inclusion, and do it in a way that maybe it benefits MasterCard, but that's not our primary goal. It's actually really to benefit sort of all the stakeholders playing in that space.
How is that believable, or how do you get?
But that's I mean, I think we're doing it through our action and through showing independence, also from the corporate side. But,
transparency.
Transparency, sure.
I think one of the ways in which open research and perhaps global solution networks can play into that it's by lending that authenticity and that transparency and that independence to a point of view. If you're partnering with other organisations, you cannot then be accused of being just your point of view.
Right.
So I think that can really help things.
Yeah.
I think that's where we can also look at some of the challenges that we have as organisations that are reporting, is you can lift yourself out of that focus on the now into the longer term by being more involved in that kind of longer term research, I think.
David, then Simon.
I'd like to move the conversation a little bit through the way. And you have that tantalising throwaway line towards the end about with China and Russia and so on, which are examples recently of illegal game. And I can't help thinking that so far we've had quite a sort of a liberal, democratic, Western view of how these kind of new entities are going to play out. And I'd really be interested as to your emergent thinking from both of you about how does the whole re-emergence of China in particular potentially change some of these emergent models.
Mm-hmm. Should we take a couple of comments and then
go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
So I was really interested in the point about globalization and changing dimensions of globalization. What seems clear was that globalization 1.0 was about kind of transcendence of the transnational corporation and how that beat big politics, so to speak, and turned it into little politics. Does that mean that in globalization 2.0, corporations are going to have to pick sides? Because there's a natural inconsistency. I.e., if I'm operating as a US-based multinational and I'm dealing with China and the norms are different in China, or I'm dealing with the Middle East and the norms are different in the Middle East, and they're inconsistent with the neoliberal politics of the nation state that I'm based in, that basically that's going to preclude me from being a truly transnational organization, because I can't go better. And I would quote the SmithKline situation in China recently, the GSK situation in China, but there are numerous examples of where corporations are tripping up with their own politics with a small p in terms of their ability to act as truly transnational organizations. Does that mean we're going to have to pick sides?
Well, let me have a go at trying to join those two questions up. So the first thing, which is there were two interesting assumptions behind both of those points. And actually, where I would do is I would spin it round and say, so how are emerging market multinationals going to be approaching what's going on in Europe and what's going on in North America? Because I think it's not just about how do we, if you like, I suppose say we, sort of American and European multinationals handle those sort of situations. And I think it's fascinating, because if you look at Chinese multinationals, particularly in Africa, it's very clear that they are using Ethiopia as the gateway into Africa. And what we see is Chinese multinationals buying positions into global supply chains. And actually what's happening is that Chinese companies are not buying big brands, but they are building sort of their positions in the sort of supply chains. So I think it's very interesting that we don't just think of this through a Western lens, but we actually think about emerging because essentially emerging market multinationals, if you like, or multinationals coming from emerging markets are probably growing in the top 500 companies now, growing at roughly about 7 per annum. So we're now up to about 130, 140 out of the top 500. So by 2020, about a third of the top 500 companies will come from these sort of parts of the world. And that, I think we need to understand the way they operate. It's very interesting that if you look at companies like Huawei, I think they still have some of the sort of the Chinese mindsets at the top, and they're actually also struggling with actually how do they, with a Chinese Shenzhen mindset, actually cope with running operations in Turkey or in other parts of the world. So they've got some challenges in there as well. The second thing I would just say is, obviously, the China and the Russia thing is very interesting and also quite complex. So Russia, I think, is the fundamental issue about Russia. You've got to remember is it is basically Tsarist land. Putin runs Russia like a Tsar. There's a contract between the Tsar and the people, and provided standards of living go up, then everybody stays happy. And basically, standards of living in Russia have gone up, so everybody's broadly happy. The big issue in Russia is diversification in the economy, and the question then becomes: diversify where? Spheres of influence. And by the way, how does China versus Europe play out? That's the landscape, and if you want to operate in Russia, you better understand those are going to be the rules of the game. I think China is even more complex because essentially you've got big rebalancing going on in China. And I think that it isn't, so I think, Simon, to your point, is that if you're going to operate in China, I think the question is still license to operate, but you absolutely have to understand Chinese play everything on the long-term game. So there is some predictability now. I'm not a believer that China's going to crash any time soon, but the rules may change over time. And there are some huge issues in there in the banking sector, how it's going to run, what's going to happen to healthcare, how basically the Communist Party is going to particularly sort of disseminate power out because it's 16 countries in one. So, but to me, this is all about global and local, and you're going to actually end up with having global scale, and you're going to have to be able to adapt to your local markets. And I don't think it's going to be a yes or no, but I think that's adaptability and the premium on that's going to be very important.
If the values are inconsistent, i.e. the values of your local market are consistent with your global values, how do you play that tension?
Well, I think you have to decide. I think you have to decide what's I think you have to decide what your bottom lines are. So if there are certain things about Saudi practices which you don't like, then you have to make that choice that that's unacceptable.
Well, and as many companies have done. I mean, bribery is completely acceptable in many geographies, but started with companies like Hewlett-Packard many decades ago. They said, we don't care. We're not going to do it. Alistair, and then we're going to have to, okay, Schubert, and then, do we have to wrap this up? I guess we should.
We want to hear what they have to say.
Okay. Alistair, go ahead.
I'm a researcher with the GSN program. Yeah, I just want to go back to your point on big E, small p, which I really agree. And you talk about globalization at this stage needs big economics and small politics. And I think that big economics, by big economics, we should be able to see where we should look at the circular economy. Yeah, I would like to get an example of the natural resource dimension. I'm not sure whether you're aware of a couple of reports recently which forecast that we're facing an economic or even civilization collapse because we're running not because we're running out of minerals, but because the minerals can no longer be extracted with economic feasibility, and the rate of exploitation by humans is much faster than regular regeneration by nature. And for example, I take lithium production as an example. Lithium is used for car batteries, and the demand for this is really great because of the large-scale electrification of our transport infrastructures. And to be sustainable, we need at least 80 to 100% recycling. But what we're doing now is just less than 1%. As part of this program, I interviewed quite a number of directors of businesses and also some existing networks. What you talk about the leadership quality is really true. I think many of them really need humility. But it was a very frustrating experience to interview them because when I tried to allude to a possible multi-stakeholder network, which is about whether you can form some network of NGO governments and share big data to see how much minerals, for lithium or phosphorus, can be extracted for a particular year. Where can they find the recyclables and how much they need to be recycled every year? And they told me that, this is very ideal to be true, but it's quite consistent with what Dawn experienced. I don't want to involve government because I want to give credit to politicians after I solve the problem. When I talk to civil society who have a particular interest in natural resource governance, they will say that, the online stuff is very great, but I don't believe it will be mainstream anytime soon. It can be a cheerleader. Yeah, this is definitely true, but I don't do it like that. So I'm wondering whether you agree that this is a recent observation, and what can we do to do the ice breaking or to re-educate these leaders who are not yet in the mindset yet?
Okay, let's just take the other point and then I'll comment on that.
Schubert?
I just actually wanted to go back to kind of business in these networks, in the global solution networks. And because, as Don mentioned in his talk, private sector is a relatively new player in these kind of global issues and new networks. And each of these stakeholders comes with its own set of accountability issues, governance models, and they're accountable to different people. The private sector is accountable to its shareholders and other things. And so when it gets involved in these global problems, are these different governance models and accountability structures, is that a problem? And how does the private sector, how does it resolve that issue with who is it accountable to in the end?
Okay.
Well, and is there a stakeholder model of a corporation emerging? Let me do that as a corollary on that too.
Let me go.
Oh, and by the way, should we also not downplay the importance of a liberal arts undergraduate education to create creative thinkers who can understand these big picture things? Sorry, I don't mean to.
So when I'm talking to some of the guys in Accenture, and I'm talking about sales, I say, need help us, all right? So there's no point about saying they need help from Accenture if they basically don't sort of understand fundamentally what the need is. And I think one of the challenges with the circular economy sort of stuff is you have to get people to understand why it matters. And actually, I think, and it's the same with, I think, a lot of the language around the multi-stakeholder, is no point banging on about multi-stakeholders, this and that, if people don't understand why it matters. In other words, what's the fundamental problem here, and why is it a problem for your business? And I do think we need to do a better job at being able to articulate about why this is a problem, why it's a problem now, and why it's an issue for your particular business. And just giving them an answer, which is we need to have a more circular sort of business model, I don't think we'll cut the mustard until we've got enough people to sort of basically understand why. Now, I think we could go in, and there are plenty of, I think, interesting companies beginning to do interesting things. But I think there's a big educational job around the circular economy, which we've really got to work, and we've got to put it into language, which these guys really sort of get. So I think that would be my sort of first fundamental point. And then secondly, on this question about who are the sort of the stakeholders, well, I think increasingly we are, I think, having to recognize as businesses that we do live in an ecosystem, basically. And if you're living in an ecosystem, you need to understand the different dimensions of what that actually sort of means. And again, the reason is we're not in an ecosystem because we want to necessarily be in an ecosystem or because we sort of like the idea. It's because there's some very fundamental reasons why. And one of the big reasons at the moment is industry boundaries are blurring. And if industry boundaries are blurring, you take electric cars, for example. So industry boundaries are blurring all over the place. And the moment you start sort of thinking about that, you say, okay, electric sort of vehicles, all right? So if I want to park a car, I need a utility, I need a comms company, I need a bank because I need to be able to pay for it, I need to build the car, and I need some software. All of that. And then you sort of say, so how are we going to get some standards agreed? How do I make sure that if I'm driving an electric car and we've got intelligence in the roads, that when I'm driving in England, it's going to be the same as when I drive around? Oh, I need to start in talking to the politicians on the standards. I need to be thinking in those sorts of dimensions. And so I think the really interesting thing about this is that these things are not happening randomly, but they're happening because I think fundamentally business models are being changed and business models are being challenged. And as you challenge them, then what's happening is I think business leaders are having to think more expansively about the ecosystems that they're involved in. And that gets you very quickly into the multi-stakeholder platforms. And that, I think, is one of the leadership challenges that people are struggling with, because that's not what a lot of today's leaders have come up on.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next session. We'll continue this over dinner. I hope you're will participate in that and throughout the rest of the day. So, Mark, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I wanted to use my prerogative to make a couple of unauthorized comments on all of that, because it was a good discussion. Authenticity. And these are seriously unauthorized. We don't have a point of view on this. I think a reputation for authenticity is the byproduct of behaving with integrity. And integrity has 4 values in business. You're honest, You consider the interests of others. You care. I'm negotiating something with you. I actually give a damn about you. Thirdly, that you abide by your commitments. You're accountable. And fourth is that you have candor. You're open. A degree of transparency. That, it turns out, is the foundation of trust. Trust is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity, that they'll be honest, considerate, accountable, and open. You know, the expression, what are they hiding, shows a relationship between trust and transparency. And if you have integrity, then you get a reputation for being authentic. Now, let me segue from that into Mark's very thoughtful point about 3 levels down. It's one thing for the CEO to have a reputation for integrity or to make lots of good statements or for you to have a corporate value statement or whatever. It's another thing to bake it into the DNA of your organization. And that comes down to compensation systems, business processes, information technology, and all kinds of other stuff. So here's a quick story. Years ago, Royal Caribbean was found to be systematically dumping oil and toxins into the sea. This is a problem when all of your marketing is about the sea and the beauty of the sea, and come share the sea with us. Front page of the New York Times, their CEO's got to quit. They bring in a new CEO, a man of great integrity, and he says, I'm going to figure out what happened.
That was my intention.
He comes back a couple of months later, he stands up in front of the world and he says, it's true. We were polluting the sea. This is a violation of everything that I personally, as CEO, agree with and of our corporate values. And I'm here to tell you this will never happen again. 4 months later, Royal Caribbean is found to be systematically dumping oil and toxins into the sea. What's going on here? He's got integrity. They got a value statement. They didn't bake it in 3 levels down. Well, and throughout into the DNA of the organization. Turns out that engineers on boats were being comped for cost control, and they found that they could save hundreds of thousands of dollars by bypassing the pollution control devices in the boats. It wasn't built into their business processes. It wasn't built into their IT and their measurement systems. So it's one thing for a CEO to say, I believe in, companies shouldn't externalize their costs onto society. It's another thing for that to be part of the DNA. So that's a theme that we're looking at here, is how do companies change their DNA to effectively participate in these things. The other thing I wanted to say was, and I'll just throw it out there, there's a very interesting company that I wonder if all of these tectonic forces will cause it to change and start to behave more reasonably, and that's FIFA.